Geoffery Dennis, independent emerging markets commentator, who's joining in. Jeff, always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Let me start with the pace of trade deals. And does that become the next catalyst for what we see, especially in the Indian context, where even FII seem to be rediscovering the India story?
I think the trade deals are very, very complicated to put together. Significant, deep, detailed trade deals are very hard to put together. And therefore, I personally don't think we should get too carried away about any individual country and how quickly they can do a trade deal with the US. Now, obviously, there could be a quote unquote trade deal because China decides in concert with the US to reduce these ridiculously high tariffs, without there being much behind it. But to see broad trade deals across all of these countries that want a trade deal, it's going to be very difficult. I think India remains in a relatively good situation vis-a-vis trade deals. For a start, it doesn't have as big a deficit with the US trade deficit, as do a number of other countries such as Taiwan, such as China, such as Mexico, and such as Korea. Also, India is a relatively closed economy. Economy is not as much impacted by the export sector. The export sector, let me put it another way, is not as big in the Indian economy as in other economies. And you're also getting some benefit from things like soft oil prices. So the very nice rotation back from China into India since the beginning of since the beginning of April, which is worth about 900 basis points according to the MSCI relative indices, I suspect will go a little further. So that's really the way I see India at this point.
Jeff, just to go further on that point that you just made. Hi, morning, or good evening, where you are. CLSA just put out a note. It said that uncertainty on global trade is bringing back TINA, which is there is no alternative. And Neeraj and I had a couple of chuckles. It's been a while since we were talking about TINA in the context of India, so TINA is turning. And so the question that I have is, we've seen significant flows, foreign flows into India over the last few sessions, particularly yesterday, 8,000 plus crore on a net basis. The question is about the durability of that. So if things change very dramatically in the US, and earnings has not been terrible, you have 75% of the S&P 500 companies so far, 157 companies that have actually beaten estimates. So if things turn on that trade front, could money flow back very quickly?
2 points there, I think, 2 areas of discussion there. First of all, I tend to believe that we're getting a short-term bounce here. I'm not saying we haven't passed the bottom, but we're getting a short-term bounce. It's very powerful. But I don't think the selling is over necessarily for a number of reasons. First of all, we've still got to get through the US economic data, which will eventually deteriorate. A lot of support for the data right now by short-term buying ahead of the tariffs, whether it's by companies or whether it's by consumers. Inflation's going to pick up. The Fed's not going to be able to do very, very much about that. And as I say, I think we're all getting a little carried away about where these tariffs are going to go in the short term, i.e., are we going to get trade deals? So my base case here still is that I think the dollar probably drifts lower again at some point. The bond yields are a tug of war between the weak US economy and the, if you like, the sell America trade, which is stopped for the time being. And also, I think equities in the US will pull back for a period of time. Now, how does India do in that particular context? I think it does very, very well, because in relative terms, it is a defensive play in relative terms, especially within Asia. If you look at these big 4 markets in Asia, China is absolutely in the gun sights of the US, if I can use that expression. In terms of the trade war, the high tariffs, we know that. The Korean economy has just fallen, looks like it's going to go into recession, has a huge trade surplus with the US. And Taiwan is very dependent on the performance of TSMC, which of course is very dependent in turn on the Mag 7 and the US. So you look at these big markets in Asia, I think the flows that have come back to India are absolutely the right trade. And I think those flows will continue. Again, in a context, to be fair, in my view, where I think we're going to see a bit more global selling eventually, and this is not going to be a straight line back up again, because I think the fundamental challenges here are still severe. The US economy, the scale of the tariffs, the trade war that's going on, the uncertainty generated by this, and frankly, the terrible and capricious policies of President Trump.
Yeah. Jeff, good evening to you, Neeraj here. Been a while, so lovely talking. Just, I mean, I understand it's very difficult to predict what could happen, but I heard your view on what could happen to EMs. Just one thing here. Now, I have counted at least 5-6 instances wherein there has been a public declaration by the US about either a visit to China or a visit from China or a trade talk with China, etc., with almost complete rebuttal or non-acceptance of that from the Chinese end. So what's happening here? Is it that, I mean, even yesterday, Donald Trump has said that, oh, we are talking to China, and China said that it's all or nothing. Unless you take it back, we're not going to talk. So my question is, could it well happen that unless all the things are, sorry, you want to make a point?
No, keep going.
No, I'm just saying, could it well happen that unless all the tariffs are taken back, there might not be a conversation at all in the first place, and therefore this tariff war, as we see it right now, may cease to be one altogether?
Absolutely. I think that could well happen. Now, first of all, neither Trump nor Xi Jinping want to talk to each other until we have the fundamentals of a trade deal. That is obvious, and we're hearing that from both sides. And we don't have that yet, so I would not expect to see Xi and Trump talking. I think there probably is some low-level official conversations going on between the US and China, which could end up with some easing of this tariff situation. But what I think is very interesting is if you look at the public comments from both sides, they are saying, the US is saying, we won't talk to China until China reduces the 125% tariffs on US goods. In other words, reduces or even removes the retaliatory tariffs. And China is saying, we're not going to talk to the US until the discriminatory tariffs on China versus the 10% across the board, which are on a lot of other countries, the base level of tariffs, until we get back to that sort of level. So everybody, both sides are waiting for the other to take a step here. And frankly, I'm not sure they're going to do that. I think we've got a lot of water to flow under the bridge here before we get any sort of decent trade deal, which I think is going to justify the market's optimism. Now, Trump, of course, could come out and say, forget the reciprocal tariffs, which we were going to put on, and then we delay them for 3 months. Maybe he could cut tariffs here and cut tariffs there. But to actually settle the China-US trade war, which it is, I think it's going to be very hard. And you can see that from the lack of really high-level negotiations. And both countries want the other side to act first.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us this morning, and pleasure having you always.